What's up, Covalence friends? Today we're continuing our testing with Jest, and we're going to be getting into some component testing. So we're going to be testing two different components today, and we're just going to get right into it. So let's go. All right, so we're going to pick up with where we left off, which is with testing components. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually take a look at our components, and we can see that we have three of them here. Generally, you'd want to actually write a test for each one of your components, but for time's sake, we're only going to do two. We're going to do the list and the navbar, and we're going to start with this list. So let's go ahead and create a new file in the list folder, and we're going to call it list.test.tsx, and we're going to start importing some stuff. So let's import React from React, and then we're actually going to start needing to import a couple functions from the React testing library. So we will import something called render and something called screen, and this is coming from @testing_library/React. And then we're going to also need the list itself, as well as the props, which I'm not sure if they're exported yet, but we can do that pretty easily. And that is from list. And so we can see, obviously they're not. So we'll go to the file and we will just export the interface iprops. And so we can see that all we have is a post. And so we're going to want to go ahead and we're going to want to create these default props. So we can say default props is of type iprops, and that equals this, and it's going to be posts, and it's going to just be an empty array. So by default, we're going to just have an empty array. Now we need to actually create the render component function. So we're going to define this variable, render component, and it is going to be a function that takes in props, and by default, it's going to be empty, and it's going to return an object. And this object is going to be calling this render function, and we're going to be passing in the list, and we're going to be giving it default props, and we're also going to be giving it the props that we're passing in. So you can see it's actually taking in, the render function is taking in this component as its argument. And then we also need to supply the props themselves as well. So we're going to just do our default props just like before, where we're deconstructing these values, and props that we're passing in as well. So this is our render component function. We'll be able to call this for our tests, and it will actually create this list object that Jest will then now know about. So we have our render component. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to actually test this now. So the first thing that we want to do is we're going to just check that the none is called. So we're going to say check that, verify that none, no posts are rendered, and that's going to just be a function. So this just means when no posts are rendered, which means we're going to be passing in the default value. So we can just call render component. This fires this function, creates the list. We go to this list, we can see that if the posts are not an array or that the length is 0, and again, you may want to pass in, you may want to test two options. You want to say render component with default value, which is an empty array, and you may also want to pass in an object like this where posts are null. So you could have two different tests. Why don't we go ahead and just say no posts are rendered with null, and no posts are rendered with empty array. And this second one is just going to be the default, right, render component. So let's go ahead, we're going to put this one first, and this is going to be our second test, and we're going to actually perform literally both in the exact same one. And that's just going to be that we're going to check that this exists. Now what we can do is we can give this a test ID. So we're going to call this none. And then for our list, we're going to do data test ID equals list. And so what Jest allows you to actually do is, it's actually not even Jest, it's this testing library that is actually doing this. But what we're going to do is we're going to expect that we grab this, none. So we can say expect, and we'll say screen.get by, get by test ID. Get by test ID, and that's going to be none, and we're going to expect that to be in the document. All right, so we just want to make sure that that's in the document, and we can do the exact same thing here as well. And so that's just going to check to make sure that this does not, or that does exist. And so we will go ahead, let's open up our terminal, and we're going to just run npm test. And it's still going to run all of our util testing, all of our unit testing as well. So it's going to run all of that. So it's going to take a little bit. I'll just talk while this is running. And you can see that everything ran. We had a total of 4 tests, 2 test suites, and that was just our index.test.ts and utils, and then our list.test.tx here. So just to make sure that we're not getting a false positive, let's go ahead and just change this to list, and we're going to npm test this. So this should not be the case, right? We did give a test ID to list, but this should be returning here and never getting down here. So this test ID should not be in the DOM. And you can see that one of our test suites failed. It says that this exact function right here is the issue. And it even gives you the actual nodes that are created, right? So you can see that this is what our DOM would look like. And you can see that it is the data test ID none. It is the exact, the elements that are provided up here. You could even check to make sure that these classes exist and everything. So there's a lot that you can do here, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to make this pass again. All right, so we have the no post rendered with empty array, we have no post rendered with null, and what we can also do is we can say that posts are rendered correctly too, right? And so we're actually going to pass in an array, and what we can actually do here is going to be, I don't like the way this looks, so let's go ahead and fix that. There we go, that looks a little bit better. And I believe it's something like kind t3 and then data is an object, I think. And the data has an ID, just some random numbers like this. So we're just going to mock the data. We could do an entire file of mock data. That's what I would recommend, but for this case, we don't need the entire file right now, so we're just going to pass in, let's just do 3 of these things. And we'll slightly, change these by, 1 character. All right, so now we have 3 different posts. So we can actually grab, expect. Now we can actually, what we can do is we can say const list equals, and we're going to just set this to be a variable. So we can say get by test ID list, and then we'll pass in list to the expect function. We expect it to be in the document, and we expect that list.children to have length 3, right? So it's going to check that this node, right, has a length of 3. So that is all it's really going to do. We could just say list.children.length to be 3. I just wanted to show you that there are more functions. It's kind of not necessary, but good to have. So to have length 3, we should be able to run this now. Let's go ahead and npm test. And we should have an extra test being run. Test suites are still 2, but the number of tests should be higher now. All right, so we got 5 pass tests, right? So that's the 3 tests here, plus the 2 tests in the original index.utils, right? So we have all of these rendering well. So let's go ahead and move on to our navbar. All right, the navbar is going to be slightly more complicated, and you'll see why. But let's do our navbar.test.tsx, and we're going to go ahead and just kind of copy a lot of this stuff up here. We're just going to speed things up a little bit. So we have our render in our screen, and we're going to be rendering things from navbar, and we'll call it navbar as well. And we also have to go ahead and export this interface. So export interface, iprops, and that should fix this issue, which it does. Let's go ahead and make sure we save that. And we're going to save this as well. And let's go ahead and do our default props. Although it's not posts, now we're dealing with dark and on theme change. So what you can actually do is you can just copy this like that. And then we'll just change this to be false and on theme change. What we can actually use is a function from Jest, and it's going to be just jest.function, which is basically just a no op. I don't think it does anything, but it is just a nice function to have and to be able to say, because we don't actually need it to do anything in this on theme change. We'll just be checking to make sure that it's called. Unit testing, will be what makes sure that that function actually does what it's supposed to do. So component testing is a little bit higher level. You're basically just checking to make sure that things are called and not that that function is performing exactly what it needs to do. So again, we have our on theme changed here, and we have our default props. So now we need our render component, which is going to be exactly the same, except it's going to be rendering a navbar, and it's passing in the different iProps here. So it's passing in different default props, but this render component is going to be the exact same almost in every single file, except it's going to be passing in a different component. So technically you could create a function elsewhere and just pass in the component, and it would probably be smarter. It'd be a little bit cleaner. You wouldn't have to copy all this code. Highly suggest that. Definitely do it. Show us how it is. We'll probably give you a little shout out live on screen. So again, now we're ready to start testing. So what we're going to test first is we're actually going to test to make sure that if we go into iProps here, you can see that it actually uses router here, right? And so if we wanted to test something like the search capability, right, our on submit, we actually need to check that this router is pushing something, right? We want to check maybe this router push is being called, and we may want to check that it's actually being pushed with the correct value, right? Because we have two different use cases here. So to test this, we actually need a router. But how do we do that if it's using this, hook, this use router hook? So first things first, let's go ahead and just make sure that we're going to be able to actually grab this. So what we can do is we can actually give this a role, because it should have the role for search anyway. So we now have the role as search, and we're going to go ahead and now we're going to have to mock this router, which is a bit more of a pain in the butt than I personally like, but is very doable. And there may be a better way to do this as well. So if you do find a better way to do this, definitely let me know. But this is how I've been doing it. And that's what we need to do, is you actually need to mock next.router. And then we're also going to create a variable to mock this. So we're going to say const mock, or just call it mock router. And that's going to be a next router. And that's going to be this function. And then we're just going to cast it to any. Otherwise, we're going to have to supply all of the actual values that this does, which is a base router, and it's all these functions. So I would suggest not doing that. You need less if you just cast it to any. I hate casting these to any, but again, for this case, it doesn't matter too much. If you find a better way, please let us know, and let me know in particular. But we're also going to be using this use router, right? Because that's the function that's being called, is this use router hook that is in the next/router part, right, package. So what we can do is we're going to go ahead and mock out these values, which are things like base path, right, which is just going to be an empty string. And then you're going to have the function itself push, right, which is going to just be a just.function. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of copy. I have the actual next router pulled up here. So I'm going to copy all these out. And basically, you guys can go to the repo and just grab this, but you could also just check and see the bare necessities of what you would need here, because you probably don't need all of these things to make it not throw an error. But I like to include this in all of my things that I have to mock for a router. It's pretty common to mock the router, and this is basically every single function I've ever needed. So I just put this in every single mock router that I create. So you can either go ahead and use this, or you could just try only putting, the push function in there and seeing if that works. Up to you. But again, this is kind of just what I use for all my projects, and it basically has all the stuff you would ever need for any mocked router, at least that I've found so far. So you might find a case where you need more, but you can just add that on and then include that from now on. But we're going to go ahead and now mock the hook itself. So we can say, mocked use router. And this is going to be a just.mock, and we're going to mock the use router, right? And it's just going to cast it to any. But now this mocked router itself is going to mock the implementation. And what it is it's just a function that returns mock router. All right, so now when we actually call this, right, which is just going to be the use router function. When we call the use router function, it's actually going to return our mock router instead of the actual router that it normally would, right? And so now what we can do is this gives us the power to check to make sure that these functions are called, which is very nice. So we're going to now test that the push function is called in the first place. So we're going to test that, the search value correctly submitted. It's going to be a function. And what we're going to do first is we're going to render the component, and it's just going to render everything with default values, right? And we're going to now grab the search itself. So const search equals screen.getByRole search. And we're going to use a new thing called user event. And so we're going to call user event.type, and we're going to type in the search. Oh, we actually haven't. We need to import user event. So let's go ahead and import user event. And it's going to be from @testing library user event. All right, so it's just the default import or the default export that we're importing. And so we do search, and it's going to ask for an actual text string. So we're going to do T. And if we wanted to type a word, let's say test, we can just do each one separately, because React needs to actually fire the change event. And so we type each letter separately, and then what we can do is we can end it with hitting enter, and that's going to fire the submit, right? So we go into our navbar, we can see that it's actually in a form. This onSubmit is the function, and we know that if we actually click enter in this, it should fire the submit function actually. So we don't even need a button with type submit. The form itself should get the value, so we want to make sure that that actually works. And just so you know, this switch here, we can use this next. Actually, we'll get into that in a second, but I added the role right onto the input here. This switch actually renders a button with the role as switch. So we don't actually need to add a role to this element. It's actually put on there already, so we won't worry about that. But again, we want to know for sure that when we type in this input and we hit enter, it fires what we need it to fire. So the issue is that it doesn't happen all synchronously. So we actually have to call a new function that we're going to await. So it's going to be a wait for function. You can see that it just imported it right here. And we're going to wait for things in here. And we also need to change this to be async. It doesn't like us using the await keyword. All right, so we're actually going to await that our function itself gets called. So we're going to expect our mock router.push, right? And it's going to be called. And we can expect that mock router.push to be called times. We want it to be called once. So we're checking that it's called at all. And then we're checking that it's called once, right? So we're just going to make sure that all these pass. And then we can expect that mock router.push, right, is last called with, and it's going to be a string. And if we go in here, we can see that if we pass in test, it should render this, right? And so what we want to do is we're going to just make sure that it is this. All right, so just for consistency's sake, let's do just T first, and let's see what happens. So we're going to npm test, and we're expecting this to fail, at least this last part here. So everything should pass except for this last one. All right, so we got one test failed, one test suite. It says the test suite failed if one test in that suite fails. And so we can see here, it actually shows you everything that's rendered, which is cool, which we showed before. And we can see here that it actually has expected, and it expected this, and it received this, right? So when it says expected, it's actually what we're passing into the argument. So it expected that, but it actually received this. So now we know, all right, actually that's what it should be, right? So we write TEST and we hit enter, and it got the right value. So we know that, now it's not a false positive if we, fix that and we run it. So TEST enter should call the mock router.push one time with that argument. And boom. 3 test suites passed, 6 tests total passed. Everything looks good. All right, so again, that's essentially, how that would work. And, we could go ahead and we could actually check, things like the default props.onThemeChange function, make sure that fires as well, right? So if we wanted to check to make sure that the dark mode's fired, which is obviously theme change here, gets fired when the switch is clicked, right? So we could do that. Let's do that. Why not? All right, let's do one more test. We're going to test that theme change fires on toggle. And we're going to render the component. And then we're going to call user event, and it's going to be .click, and it's on the screen .get by role, and it's going to be the switch. So we just want to click that switch, and then we're going to expect that default props.onThemeChanged is called, so to be called. And we can also say the exact same thing here. It's just to be called once. All right, and the reason that we're doing this is that we go into our navbar. When this is clicked, all right, we get this onThemeChange, which is actually a property, right? So we want to make sure that this is called. We can actually check to see the value itself, right? That could be another thing, but again, this is just kind of showing you how it works. Let's go ahead and test this real quick. All right, so it's going to run everything. It's going to be 3 suites. I believe it's 7 total tests. All right, 2 pass. Oh, we got 1 to be called. All right, it looks like we do have 1 issue here. Looks like might be because we're not actually waiting. Let's go ahead and just make sure we wait for this. Run that one more time. Yep, and now we got all the pass. So I just forgot to wait for it actually. So it does take a second. It is not immediate. So when we actually click the event, we have to wait a second, and we got to make sure that this onThemeChange was called and that it was called once. So all these things were called, and just to make sure again that it's not a false positive, let's just run this one more time. Again, you guys can play around with these as well just to make sure that, obviously it isn't just all being made up, but we want to make sure. And bam, we got 1 failed. See, it passes, it gives us the whole thing, and then it just shows that the expected number of calls is 2, but it only received 1 call, right? So it works pretty well, all these wait fors and everything. It almost seems like magic a little bit, but it does work pretty amazingly. And again, this is that component level testing. You could go in and you could actually do an even higher level of testing, which would be more of integration style testing at our index level, where you actually test the rendering of the components in the page itself. So I'm going to let you guys kind of move on from there, and I hope you enjoyed. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I hope you learned a little something today. There wasn't anything too complicated, but I know that mocking things can get a little confusing. So if you have any additional questions or you need help, testing a component of your own, be sure to drop the question in the comments below or join our community itself and post it in our Discord channel. Otherwise, definitely subscribe, and we'll see you soon.